It's like that point of this.
Such a nice foggy morning. I like it. It was so hot. The last couple of days, it felt like spring. There was like birds chirping. Oh, not a big fan of spring. And my littlest one was like, I love spring. It's the best. I'm like, you're like the one in the family. Everyone else loves the fall. But I'll take it. It's nice today. I'll enjoy the cooler weather before it gets crazy hot again. But we'll pick up where we left off. Just a quick review. If we go back, right, we talked a ton about symptoms last time. Lots of video clips, hopefully kind of help make those different symptoms clear. So we talked about the positive ones, again, not good symptoms, but additions to normal behavior, the negative ones or the deficits, and then the psychomotor symptoms like being catatonic or having those weird like grimaces or movements or getting stuck. And what we'll talk about today is the other half, which having to do with like the course, the causes, and the treatments for schizophrenia. Are there any like thoughts or comments, anything from last time? Anything that you thought of before we move forward? Anything at all? Okay. Then when it comes to how this tends to present, it tends to follow 3 phases. Really common that people go through a prodromal phase, an active phase, and then sometimes even a residual phase. And this is pretty commonly seen, though there's an interesting distribution with schizophrenia. Sometimes what you get is people develop what's called the prodromal phase, but they never get worse. They start to show some signs of schizophrenia, like things are starting to deteriorate. Maybe they don't know what's real or what isn't real, but it never goes any farther than that. About like a fourth of cases, about 25% of cases, never go beyond the prodromal phase. About 50% of cases stay in the active phase. And this is when all the symptoms are present, somebody requires treatment, they have like full-blown apparent schizophrenia. And then another 25% will transition to a residual phase. So some people actually get better on their own without treatment. Just over time, the symptoms can kind of lessen and go back to like an earlier level of functioning. But about half of people with this disorder require long-term treatment and the symptoms don't really go away. And this is really common to start in kind of like the 20s to the mid 30s, but it can happen in childhood, as we talked about last time, but that's not the most common presentation. What you often see is that it's more like in the 20s and 30s, or even maybe the late teens. And interestingly, my first semester here, I had a young man, and it was in this classroom, sat right there. It's an empty seat today. He was developing schizophrenia. You know, after this lecture, he came up to me and he's all like, I think that I might have this disorder. And I was like, well, what makes you think that? And he's like, well, I oftentimes don't know what's real and what isn't real. Like sometimes I'm confused if someone actually said something or they didn't. He's like, you know, that moment where you wake up from a dream and you can't tell if it's real or not? I have that all the time. Right. And he was talking about it. He was saying that sometimes he'll hear voices and he doesn't know if they're real or not. He'll see things, he doesn't know if they're real. And he went and got evaluated, and it turned out he was in the early stages of schizophrenia. Now, super bright, like friendly young guy, I would have never known, right? This exists on a spectrum. So some people, this stuff can be really, really mild. Other people, it can be like devastating and really interfere with their life pretty profoundly. So it tends to follow this course. And again, about half of people stay in that active phase kind of permanently, right? And some never get worse and some get better on their own. He stayed in the class the whole semester too. Again, I never would have known that he had any kind of signs of schizophrenia. Some people can be very, very mild, and it tends to affect people who are very intelligent, which is kind of cruel in a way, but that tends to be very common with this disorder. So if we look at causes, there's a lot of biological stuff. I was actually reading an article this morning, or part of an article this morning about the genetic markers for schizophrenia. And they're discovering more and more like genetic elements to this. but there's a lot of biological views related to schizophrenia. And I mentioned this last time, the diathesis stress perspective and dopamine are two of the biggest culprits with this disorder. So the leading thought is that there is a genetic biological predisposition to get this disorder, right? We don't 100% know what that is or how to track it, but it's like the C4 genome, right, that they're starting to discover. But what we're seeing is that people have a biological predisposition, but whether or not they ever get the disorder depends on the environment. So it's a little bit of like a nature-nurture interaction, right? So if somebody has a biological predisposition and they experience an extreme stressor or a trauma, it could bring that predisposition forward and then they develop schizophrenia. If they use a drug, for example, maybe they use a hallucinogen that alters their brain chemistry, that could be the stressor that causes a drug-induced schizophrenia, right? So if somebody develops drug-induced schizophrenia, they would have had to be biologically vulnerable to it. But as of right now, that's not something we can test for yet. Like it does tend to run in families, but it's not as clear-cut as it, maybe could be. So this is a really big one, the thought that we're born with it in place, and then whether or not we ever realize that disorder has a lot to do with the environment. And that's true of a lot of disorders, really, but it's very true here with schizophrenia. We also look a lot at dopamine. Dopamine is a huge culprit when it comes to this. Other neurotransmitters too, but dopamine, specifically too much dopamine, is thought to cause a lot of those positive symptoms, the hallucinations and the delusions and so on. And so a lot of the treatments for this disorder focus on reducing dopamine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what we see is that people just have too much of it. And a lot of recreational drugs will affect dopamine, and same with prescription drugs. When I was a teenager, I took an antidepressant called Effexor, and I called it side effectsor in my head because it caused me to hallucinate for the first time because it affects dopamine. It flooded me with dopamine, and I could see like everything around me like floating. It was surreal. It was terrifying, right? I can't even imagine what it would be like to experience that on a daily basis. Luckily, I went off the medication and like all of that went away. But oftentimes for people who have too much dopamine, it can cause a lot of issues, right? Including hallucinations and delusions and so on. There's also some stuff with abnormal brain structures related to the production of dopamine, right? So what we see is that there's like enlarged ventricles, the hippocampus is a little bit different. Hard to know if those cause it or if they're just correlated, but the biological stuff is huge with schizophrenia. And that's part of the reason why the treatments are so medically driven, so drug driven, because we really do believe it has a lot to do with dopamine and glutamate and a couple of others. And I have a little video that talks about these a little bit. You've seen this guy a couple of times before, not the most thrilling, but I think it's the drugs. He has like a part 2 for that. But I like that he's kind of going over these things a little bit more, right? Kind of talking about some of these different biological factors. Again, these are really big ones. Dopamine being the biggest culprit, but also, as you mentioned, serotonin and glutamate and others. So a lot of biological stuff going on, right? And again, that will drive the treatments that we get to. But there are a couple of other views. These are much smaller. And the first one was popular for a lot of years, but it's fallen out of favor. Freud, and then the object relations theorists that came shortly after him, proposed something called the schizophrenic mother. Tried to find a mom who looked angry, right? Like a woman who looked mad, like she's yelling at you. It was thought for a lot of years that a cold, domineering, like harsh, uninterested mother could cause someone to develop schizophrenia. Very Freudian, right? Like it had to be the mom, like your cold mother would cause you to develop schizophrenia. And so Freud and others proposed that if you had a cold, domineering, like angry, very unloving mother, that it could cause you to develop schizophrenia. Now, we know that that's not necessarily true. It can run in families, which obviously confuses things a little bit, the whole nature-nurture debate. But what we see more is it's like the level of expressed emotion in a family that can cause problems. And this doesn't have to just be schizophrenia. The emotion and environment of your parents and your family can lead to all kinds of difficulties, right? And kind of precursors to mental illnesses. And so what we see is that we get these like sociocultural views where we're looking at social forces playing some kind of a role but it's not nearly as strong or like impacting as the biological stuff. So it's not really fully understood, but it's thought that some degree of like social forces can play a role, all the way down to the fact that if you diagnose somebody with a disorder, all of a sudden they start showing symptoms of that disorder in a different way. Like if you tell somebody that they have depression, sometimes their depression will get worse. Tell somebody they have schizophrenia, sometimes their schizophrenia gets worse for a time as they embrace that label. And so something about labeling people, the environment and the family and the amount of expressed emotion, it's thought to play a little bit of a role, but not nearly as much as like the biological stuff. Yeah.
Mother and the difference between what Freud didn't he say similar things about like parents and children with autism?
Yeah. Yeah, he made a lot of interesting like claims about like the role specifically of the mother, but parents in general. And he was very like heteronormative, and it had to be male, female, or it led to issues in like all sorts of different ways. But yeah, he would talk about the role of the parents in shaping any mental illness, right? That if you had someone who was very dependent, right, that it came from having like parents who kind of coddled you in a way, or maybe didn't give you enough. But so everything from a Freudian perspective correlated back to like the mom and what happened when we were really little. Very, very common for his theories. It's very hard to prove too, right? Because it could be a whole host of factors that cause that. Any others? Other thoughts, questions, comments, anything? Anything else? I'll move so she's not yelling at you anymore, right? But she looks cold and angry. I was trying to find someone to look angry. So when we get to the treatments, right, these are kind of the smaller ones, kind of building off that sociocultural perspective, and then we'll talk about the medications and such. But this is a difficult disorder to treat because somebody is psychotic and they're out of touch with reality. It's difficult to treat somebody with schizophrenia. And so there are some like smaller things that we can do, but they tend to be part of like a bigger treatment package, if you will. So if you remember back, right, all the way back into like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, we didn't treat people with mental illnesses very humanely, especially people who had things like schizophrenia, right? We would lock them away. They were subject to like cruel treatments and so on. And it wasn't until like the 1950s or so that we got this milieu therapy, right? The idea of treating people with respect and giving people like meaningful activities and responsible behaviors. Remember that like dance in a madhouse portrait and some of those things we talked about way back in chapter 1. And so one way of doing that is if somebody is in like a program, we can give them what's called a token economy, rewarding them for little like desired behaviors. And this is super commonly used with children, but it's also used when we need a very concrete system for anybody. But I use this with my kids all the time, right? If they make their bed a certain number of times a week, they get a prize, right? Like it earns them a certain number of points. If they don't fight with each other, they get points. When we were teaching them to use the bathroom, like when we were potty training them, token economy, like we've used this a million times throughout their lives, and it tends to be pretty successful. It's successful with me, right? Like you give me a chance, like if I earn a certain number of things, I get to go to ice cream, done, right? Let's do this. My parents did this all the time with us as kids. It was like, if you earn a certain number of good grades, we got a reward. And I always wanted the reward, which was ice cream, right? So I'd always get good grades. I was a straight A student because I wanted ice cream. Nothing's changed, right? All these years. So this is really commonly used not only with kids, but in programs where people are maybe hospitalized, right? So, you know, if you do your chores today, if you make your bed, you get a point or a token or a star or whatever like unit we're using. And then you can trade those in for a reward. Maybe it's a day pass or a special privilege or a visitor pass or something like that. I see you nodding, you have a, right? Because you use that a lot probably.
When I was working with autism, this is like the biggest thing. It's like, oh, you know, if you do your homework for 20 minutes, you get one. Or like if you're with your friends without like recognition, you get another one. Like my mom works at a psychiatric hospital up in Idaho, and she uses this a lot with like her like more like her worst patients, like the patients that have a lot more issues. She'll use this, and she's like, it works. Because it'll be like you get like 3 hours outside rather than like 20 minutes, and a lot of times it's like helps them build those better behaviors because they're like, oh, well, if I do good things, nothing bad is going to happen.
Right.
So.
Yeah,
Works really well.
it's very concrete. It's amazingly helpful for like little steps like that, right? It's very commonly used in psychiatric hospitals or any kind of program dealing with any kind of issue, really. It's very, very commonly used. I mean, I imagine every single one of you as a kid got like stickers, happy faces, stars, like tickets. You're all nodding, right? My kids come home, I got 3 gold tickets today. I'm like, how many do you need to get a prize? They're like 42. And I'm like, that's a lot, right? But they get like little gold cards at school or a sticker or smiley face. And then when you earn enough of them, you could trade it in for something. Usually it's some like tiny little prize. They'll come home with like a slinky and they're all like over the moon, right? Like, I got the slinky. I'm like, it took you 6 months, but proud of you. Good job, right? And so it's very commonly used here. And then also, again, with children and so on. I got totally distracted. Your shirt, Super Mario. Anyone seen that yet? I saw it yesterday. It was a very entertaining movie. Nice. Oh, look, and you still came. I admire that, right? Like I would have been tempted to not. But very funny. Jack Black sings a song as Bowser, and my kids have been singing it all morning, and it's like all I have in my head right my song. Anyway, side note, but those things are used a little bit, but these are used probably primarily, right? You really can't treat schizophrenia without medication, unfortunately. Like you can use some therapy, you can use some behavioral techniques, but medication is going to address the chemical imbalance, right? And that's what's going to be really helpful. But these drugs are incredibly difficult to tolerate. Of all the categories of drugs, antipsychotics, which is the drugs that we're using to combat psychosis, have an incredible number of side effects, right? They're very difficult for people to tolerate, but they're also incredibly helpful. So antipsychotic drugs reduce psychosis, right? So they really started to be around in like the 1940s, 1950s, and then they've gotten more refined and better over time. They used to be called neuroleptic drugs, right? There are these conventional antipsychotics, but they were called that because they produce so many neurological side effects, shaking and tremors and akathisia, like constant trembling and shaking, very, very common. They cause what are called extrapyramidal effects. Unwanted movements are very, very common, bizarre grimaces, twisting of the body, extreme restlessness, right? They have an incredible number of things that make them difficult to tolerate. But when they reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia, people can then function more in society. So it's like this constant, balancing act. But they can cause even like really severe things like tardive dyskinesia, right? Where people have like an extended time where they have these side effects even after they've gone off the drugs. So very, very, very mixed. But thankfully, we have newer ones called atypical antipsychotics, which are a little bit better. These are things like some of the new ones are like Abilify and Seroquel. There's like a few newer ones that are less intense in terms of side effects. But the way that they work is by mainly reducing dopamine, right? By reducing dopamine, it lowers the number of symptoms, and then people don't have as many hallucinations and delusions, and they can function a little better. So they sometimes also require another drug, right, to counter some of the side effects that are coming up. So again, a constant balancing act. But now, if you went to a doctor or a psychiatrist, they would probably go with an atypical group, right? The newer ones, rather than the older, like more conventional neuroleptic ones, which had higher degrees of side effects. I have that guy, again, to kind of talk a little bit about these drugs and the side effects that come with them. So I'll play the follow-up part here. It was called Thorazine, right? If you've ever heard of Thorazine, like it's a very commonly, it's always referenced in movies and so on. Like Thorazine was like the old standby, and that would be a classic like neuroleptic or conventional one. And now, as he mentioned, and as I was talking about earlier, we have these atypical ones. And sometimes you see these atypical antipsychotics used for severe bipolar disorder as well, like Abilify and Seroquel are very commonly used for bipolar disorder. If it's severe enough that it maybe has psychotic features, or somebody has like really intense manic episodes. So you see some overlap, right? And I'm sure you've heard the same neurotransmitters are culprits for so many different disorders, which is why these medications can have multiple uses to them. Any thoughts or questions? Anything here? Anything about these? Yeah.
What about isn't Clomidine antipsychotic?
Guamamine, I'm not sure, right? I mean, it sounds familiar, right? You could look it up really quickly if you wanted to. There's so many of them. There's over 100 easily of these. Oh gosh, I've heard of it, but I don't remember. Guanine, there's a couple of them that are like close to that. Was there another?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and she makes.
yeah,
It's like a flex, but she like talks about it, like, there's a lot of yeah. But yeah, I just think, I never knew that.
yeah. And it's really common that people who have depression or anxiety, like the medications are very interchangeable. It depends on the symptoms, right? And if mania is severe enough, people can hallucinate and have delusions of grandeur, is very, very common in mania. And so some of these can also help with that as well. So they're very commonly used for bipolar disorder, especially if it's more severe, right? Was that yeah?
They've now been used for like people with more like severe symptoms, bipolar, and also like with personality disorder.
Yeah.
Like the way that they're using psychotics as like an additional like medication for that. But it's also like interesting to think about like how that developed. That's like sounds really off-label,
Yeah.
but it like seems effective for the most part. So
Right. And I think it's just looking at similar presentations and symptoms. Really controversial to use medications for personality disorders, which is our next topic we'll get to really soon. But it is sometimes used depending on the symptoms that someone's displaying, right? Did you find out?
It was actually called guanfacine.
Oh, you were close.
It's the same as 10x, so it's for like ADHD.
Okay, right. You were on the right track, right?
Yeah.
Like guanine is one of the like bases of like DNA, right? We're getting there. We're so similar. So. Anything else here? Any other thoughts or questions? I think there's one more slide here with this chapter. Therapy, as I mentioned, difficult without medication, right? People are out of contact with reality. So it makes it very difficult to treat somebody without medications, especially if they're in the active phase of schizophrenia. But we tended to institutionalize people for a lot of years. You had schizophrenia, you'd just be locked away. Right. And we don't really do that anymore. Like back in the 80s and 90s, it started to fall out of favor. We started transitioning to deinstitutionalization. So rather than locking people away in these like long-term mental hospitals, where we started treating people more in like halfway houses, outpatient therapy, more like community-based treatments. And that's amazing, right? That we're not locking people away, but it leads to a unique issue that we call the revolving door syndrome. And what that means is people who have schizophrenia, specifically schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, tend to go into a program and get treatment. They get leveled out, they get on their medication, they're released, and then they go out into the world, they stop taking their medication, they start to get more symptoms, they kind of fall off the path, they have to be reinstitutionalized where they get back on track, and then they're released and then they like fall apart again. It's this revolving door in and out. Right. And so there are advantages and disadvantages to not treating people in an inpatient facility, but we don't have very many inpatient facilities anymore. A lot of them have been shut down or converted, right? Again, like Cal State Channel Islands and others, the YMCA that I like volunteered at all those years ago. So strange to drive by it and be like, that was a mental hospital as people are working out, but very common to have great promise with these programs, but there's issues, right? If people don't have good family support or like a good network of support, they tend to fall through the cracks and then have issues when their medication relapses. Some of the newer medications have like an extended release, or as they were showing you, injections, which is really promising because it can be hard for people with schizophrenia to remember to take their medication, right? Same with like bipolar disorder, for example. We've mentioned that a few times. People in a manic episode might feel like things are so good they don't need the medication, right? And so sometimes you see that with like more severe illnesses. And so we see this as promising, but also problematic, right? As people kind of in and out constantly. Yeah.
A lot of like patients that go off their medication and have to come to the hospital.
Yeah.
The cops have found them like trying to break into places or like kind of like go through like the motions. And I remember there's this one guy that came and we asked him if he had any family. He was like, no, my mom got so sick of me not taking my medication, she just kicked me out. And then he just like started laughing about it. It was like,
Yeah.
damn, I was like, that really sucks. And then our case manager was like, I found him an in-person place that he's just gonna have to stay for a little while. And he's like,
Yeah.
okay, and he's like, I've done that before, it doesn't work. And he's like, so as soon as you're like, yeah, just kind of stop moving on, yeah, it happens quite a bit. We get a lot of those people.
It's really unfortunate, right? And then people they become institutionalized, they go to an inpatient facility and they get back on track. You can't stay there indefinitely, right? And so that's the downside to institutionalizing people. It removes you from everything. You can get medications under control, but eventually when you're released, right, people often relapse, right? They go off their drugs and then their symptoms emerge or they get worse and worse and worse. It's a very constant cycle with a lot of mental illnesses, but specifically here with schizophrenia, it's pretty noticeable. Anything else here? Yeah.
For drug treatment and alcoholics, like people get comfortable in like an institution.
Yeah.
Such as, you know, inpatient or sober living, they get used to having the structure. People telling them to take the medication, is that kind of basically similar?
Yeah, right. So you go from this really supportive, structured environment to nothing. Yeah, which is the idea behind things like halfway houses and community treatments. It's supposed to be like halfway between, you know, being in the hospital and being in real like outpatient life, but they don't have enough support for some people or enough funding for some people. And sometimes as well, when you get groups of people together, all struggling with the same disorder, same problem, it creates other problems. Right. So yeah, there's a lot of issues with treatment. It's kind of a big global issue with psychiatric treatment, right? There are a lot of places for improvement just all around, depending, and I'm on every disorder. All right. I was thinking as I was talking about this, and I think I mentioned it last time, there's a very strong correlation between homelessness and schizophrenia as well. And what happens is you see people who have fallen through the cracks and they can no longer function within society because of those psychotic features, become homeless, right? We have a couple in Simi, like I live in Simi, and there's a woman who I always see walking around, and she comes up like every now and then in my classes, but she's definitely has schizophrenia. I see her yelling at random things and talking to random things all the time. Homeless, she wanders around and see me. I see her constantly, like everywhere I go, I see her. I don't know why. But this is something that's very common in homeless populations because they've fallen through the cracks, haven't received adequate treatment. And so they kind of end up marginalized outside of like the norm of society as well. Yeah.
What we were doing, but we ended up seeing a homeless guy who started having like he was having tremors. My mom just put some money and told him to go buy opinions because like she assumed that he would probably like want to follow through anything.
And like withdrawing or something like that.
Not getting the care that he needs, but like at least to make it successful. I hate to say it, but I was just like that reminded me of that. So
yeah, but there's sadly a lot of homelessness, and reasons for homelessness are like all over the place. Like I went to Humboldt State where a lot of people are homeless by choice. It's like a political statement, you know, of like, I don't want to be part of like the grid. I want to be off the grid. But sometimes it's because people have really like fallen through the cracks of mental health treatment, which is why we see so many cases of schizophrenia in that group. I went to a conference in San Francisco years ago, like it's probably been 12 years at this point, because it's before my oldest was born. And like we were walking to the conference and this guy was standing on the corner wearing like full robes, holding Bibles, like spouting the word of God. And then 2 feet later, I got flashed by a guy dressed as Santa. Like it was a memorable trip, right? It's San Francisco for you, right? Like, and so it was like when I was considering where to go to college, I'm like, I'm not going here. It's just a little too much for me. Like within 2 minutes, I was yelled at, told I was going to hell, and then flashed by a naked man wearing a Santa costume. It was a memorable trip, right? I don't even remember the conference, but I remember that. Right? So you see a lot of this, especially in big cities. People have fallen through those cracks, right? Sadly. All right. Any other like thoughts, stories, comments, anything else related to schizophrenia? Yeah.
Like came out of the store and he would just like start randomly screaming in our store and start like yelling and hitting random things. And I was like, I'm like, at first I was like, okay, like he probably was just like having the first time it happened, I'm like, maybe just had an experience and kept happening. I was like, okay, so this guy needs like serious help. And my manager called the boss and they're like, we're not gonna do anything about it. It seems like it's like a psychotic breakdown and anything. And I was getting him the story, like trying to like get him to leave so that like he didn't start punching people. It's not fun. Like,
Yeah,
I was like,
memorable too, probably, right?
I we stabbed over cups of coffee from homeless people. Like there have been like numerous things that have happened. And a lot of it has to do with like either schizophrenia or like another like bipolar or something. It's like really bad, and then they end up like just going berserk because they can't get the help that they need because they're not. They don't really have a like police station in Malibu. They get their cops from Calabasas, so they're going to have to come all the way out there for things.
Sure. Yeah, and they can detain someone on like a 5150 for like up to 72 hours, but there's only so many times you can do that effectively, right? And sometimes when people need more treatment than that, but they don't have access to more treatment than that, you get this constant problem, right? Where they're like detained, released, and unfortunately don't get any better. All right, let's leave that one behind. Chapter 13. So we said we mentioned personality disorders once or twice. That's this next chapter. And I think this is going to be really helpful for a lot of you. Quite a few of you suspect a personality disorder for one of your characters in your diagnosis papers that you're doing. So what we'll do for the next couple of days, we'll talk about the different personality disorders. There's kind of 3 different clusters of them. And then we'll talk about causes and treatments together and some issues. These have a lot of issues. Personality disorders are very controversial because in essence, what we're saying is that it's your entire personality that is disordered. That's kind of a hard one to swallow, right? That we're saying like everything about you is having a problem. Do you guys have a question? Did you have a question? Okay. So personality, hopefully we all only have one, right? Or we have dissociative identity disorder, right? We each have a unique personality. Everything that makes you, everything that makes you unique from the people sitting around you, probably from every other person on this planet, all the things that make you who you are, right? It's your expression of inner experience and outward behavior, your thoughts, your feelings, everything about you, starting from a very, very young age. Personalities are flexible, right? So as a person, you can kind of adapt to different situations and different things going on. People who have personality disorders have very inflexible and maladaptive ways of thinking and behaving, and it causes a lot of issues, right? You tend to kind of approach things in one way, and it can cause a lot of conflict and distress, issues in relating with other people and holding jobs and functioning in society. So there are 10 different personality disorders that are currently recognized. And they fall into 3 groups, and we'll talk about all of them, but odd disorders, dramatic ones, and anxious ones. So ones that are dominated by being kind of odd or eccentric, ones that are dominated by being more like dramatic and emotional, and ones that are dominated by anxiety. So we'll talk about all of them. And your book has this little chart, right? In it, just showing you kind of an overview. There are 3 odd or eccentric ones. There are 3 anxious or fearful ones, and then 4 dramatic, like emotional ones as well. Okay, so we'll talk about each one of these. They each have a lot of overlap, especially within categories. So I'll give you a couple of words for each one to try and keep them straight. But we'll start with the odd ones, the odd or eccentric disorders. So the first one, and I'm going to write these up here. I'll give you a couple of words. Paranoid. Okay, paranoid personality disorder. I'm going to write mistrustful of others. Let's say suspicious. And then I'll explain these in a minute, but I'm just going to give you a kind of a short thing. Unjustified doubts about loyalty. So we see somebody who's got a lot of like paranoid behavior, conspiracy theories, being mistrustful of others, looking for hidden meanings in everything. Now, this tends to be different from paranoid schizophrenia, right? Paranoid delusions were common in schizophrenia. This is somebody who only has paranoia, and it's very broad. It might be across every realm of their life, but it's not as severe as somebody who has like paranoid delusions and schizophrenia. So this person might still be able to function in like normal life and hold down a job, but they tend to have a hard time with trusting other people. They're very suspicious of others. They're always looking for like conspiracies and hidden meanings. Thinking that people are out to get you is very, very common. And with all of these personality disorders, this starts from a very young age. Now, you technically aren't supposed to diagnose any of these until someone is at least 18. Now, that can be a gray area for a few of them, but a couple of them, it's like a hard criteria. But we try and wait till someone's 18 and through most of the teen years, and their identity is pretty well formed. But what you would see is a lot of little signs of this all the way through, right? So when someone's young, they might have had a lot of these behaviors, and then it gets worse as a teenager, and then more and more severe later on. And like anything, these exist on a spectrum. So somebody might have these in kind of a mild way, or this could be so severe that it keeps them from being able to function in society. So with this one, a lot of like odd eccentric behavior, specifically around not trusting other people, being suspicious and kind of having all of those doubts and like hidden meanings to everything. And I have an example of this. It's an older movie called Conspiracy Theory. And the main character definitely has this. It kind of borders almost on paranoid schizophrenia, but I think it fits this pretty well. He mumbles a lot in the clip, so I'm sorry for that, but he just kind of talks quickly and mumbles. Very common, again, looking for those conspiracies and conspiracy theories. You see he locked up his food, right? But it's so interesting to me. I think this is always something that fascinates me about mental illness. He has all these things around paranoia, but he's fine with whacking the bug and then hanging the spatula back up. Like cleanliness and like germs don't bother him, right? Like that's not his button, right? Versus like watching that's like painful for me. I'm like, oh, that's disgusting. Like throw it away or at least wash it or something. But you see all of that paranoid behavior, right? Very, very common. And it makes people tend to be alone, right? Oftentimes loners, because it's hard to maintain relationships if you're never trusting other people, right? It makes it very difficult to be close to others. Yeah.
That felt very reminiscent of OCD, because everything he was doing seemed very habitual. And I think counting the steps up and
Yeah.
undoing the lock and then locking up everything again, it felt like that was just was part of his routine.
Sure. And you can get very like OCD like tendencies coming with this, right? People have the belief, the obsession, right, that someone's going to break in. And so then they develop the compulsions around like how many times they're going to lock the door or put the bottle there or how many locks they're going to have, right? So you oftentimes see some obsessive compulsive behavior as part of a routine to minimize the anxiety that comes from the paranoia. So it's a good observation. It's very common. They're very comorbid. You see that a lot. Yeah. Sure. So this is specifically around being paranoid about, like for him, like breaking in, contamination. It's very paranoid based. For someone with GAD, would be more like globally anxious. Like they probably also would have had anxiety about contamination from the bug, right? Or like it just would be more global, right? This tends to center around these things rather than being something that's much more like everything, right? Somebody who has GAD is more neurotic. It's like every little thing gets to them. Versus this is more like paranoid based. They can sometimes look similar, or you have to dig a little bit into the symptoms to see. Was there another hand? I thought there was one more hand. Any other thoughts with paranoid personality? Very common. And what you see with these, all three of these, is they have elements in common with schizophrenia. Right, look at the next two names, right? Schizoid, schizotypal, they're similar to schizophrenia, right? But these are, because their personality disorders are more global and they tend to be less severe. They start earlier in life. And so you see some overlap, and there's a lot of overlap within categories. So like these three are very commonly confused with each other, right? And that's a huge criticism of personality disorders in general, is that there's so much overlap. They can look so different from person to person, depending on what symptoms they display. Schizoid. So with schizoid personality disorder, we're looking at someone who doesn't tend to express a lot of emotion. They tend to be very, very solitary. So I'm going to put that up there. Solitary. They avoid relationships. They might have very few close connections with other people. They prefer to be alone. They're very emotionally cold. Right, so oftentimes being very flat, they're showing a lot of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, like not a lot of emotion, not speaking a lot. They tend to have a lot of that negative kind of side to it. So a very restricted reading. One very common example of this is like Bruce Wayne in the newer Batman movies. Like he's very solitary. He has a job that doesn't make him have to work well with other people because of his wealth. He doesn't have a lot of close connections, a couple, right? Like Alfred and a couple others, but not a whole lot. So you see him being a very common portrayal. So very loner based, very distant from other people, don't feel a lot. They don't tend to marry very frequently and tend to work in jobs that allow them to be very solitary. Again, Bruce Wayne, Batman, probably one of the best examples, the newer Batman movies, not the older. Schizotypal. I can write that down. I have two favorite personality disorders. This is one of them. Not my very favorite. My very favorite will stay for last. But schizotypal is a really interesting one. And with this disorder, we see a lot of like odd and peculiar behavior. Odd, eccentric, or peculiar behavior. This person tends to stand out because they're so eccentric, right? And where do we draw the line between kind of odd and eccentric and disordered? It's a bigger question, right? But like this person tends to stand out, right? Their behavior tends to be really odd, right? And so it's somebody that people tend to view as being odd. They have a lot of ideas of reference, like strange perceptual distortions, or perceptual and cognitive distortions. And they have really odd, like magical beliefs about the world around them. Very common to see that. I have a story for you. I have somebody that I knew in high school who I would bet anything had schizotypal personality disorder. I went through lots of phases in high school, as most people do. I think this one's probably scared my parents pretty badly. But when I was a sophomore, I like totally hung out with this like very dark, like odd group of people. And one of them, everybody called knee pads. It's not what I called her, but the school called her knee pads because she wore knee pads and elbow pads to school. Really odd person. Definitely stood out, like somebody would notice. Everyone was terrified of her. So I was so safe, right? Because it was in the inner circle, right? I was safe. But like really strange group. Like they all played like Dungeons and Dragons. Not that that's necessarily bad, but like I get teased for that all the time in my family. But they all played that. They believed all sorts of interesting things. Knee pads believed that she was half human, half dragon. Her dragon half was male and her human half was female. And she would walk around campus and like every now and then go like this, flicking her tail to hit people. I never saw a tail, but it was hilarious. Like everywhere we go, she'd flick her tail and I kept waiting to see it one day. She's like, I'm going to get him with my tail and flick her tail. Again, odd phase of life here, but I would bet anything looking back that she had this, right? When she turned 18, she changed her name legally to her dragon name, which was super interesting. I'm so curious. I wish I could find like where this individual is now, like follow up as an adult. I'd be scared, but I'm curious. But she would wear like a trench coat to school. But this was during the time of like some of the early school shootings, like Columbine. They banned trench coats, so she wore a black sheet around her neck because there was no rules about sheets in the dress code. She had like a black belt in karate, very scary person, but believed that the world was going to end due to like magical forces. And again, half human, half dragon, right? This was someone I was friends with for like a year, and then it was too much for me. Like, I think it was like the early psychologist in me was like so fascinated by this. That's how I justify it anyway. But really like odd, eccentric, peculiar behavior. is common with this disorder. Again, a lot of like odd thinking and perceiving, magical beliefs, magical thoughts are very common. Tend to not have a lot of friends because they are odd, right? And so it kind of pushes people away by nature. I have an example of this, not nearly as like odd in a way, but definitely someone who's peculiar. Luna from Harry Potter, right? She is very much along these lines. She kind of stands out. She's a little odd, much sweeter than Epads, right? But still a little like strange. I have a little clip of Luna, and she tends to be